as we just heard, the presentation is called the Intellect Imaginaries and the Early Web for Kids, and it comes out of the Web Child project, which is comes from an ERC grant by the European Research Council. So just a little bit, so there was just an introduction to me, but just a little bit about like where I come from. So yeah, I'm a historian, and I'm trained as a historian, and my background is in history. And then I have come from like a classical history background to do I did media history, but is now doing more digital history, also involving digital methods. I also teach digital methods at Old University. We teach all of our BA students to code a little bit in history. So that's where I'm coming from, having like spent a lot of time on training historians as well in the Center for Digital History, which I co-direct with my colleagues, Adela Subatkova. And lately I got funding for the Web Child project, and is starting then, and that will run from, it's been running from 1st of April and will run for 5 years. And I have a background, the project brings together sort of my digital history interest, especially sort of web history, and then my interest in sort of more classical childhood history. So that is the investigation of children historically. My talk today will have sort of two aims. It's to introduce to the Web Child project, and then I will introduce a pilot study on a forum called KidLink, because I think there is some really interesting historical reflections to be had looking at the KidLink project, which was this very, very early forum for kids, and then some of the work that ReDICo has been doing on platforms, which I think could work really nicely together. So that's why I wanted to highlight this pilot study on KidLink. But let's start in 2000. So here we see a Danish girl, Helene. We see her website. On the website, for those of you who don't read Danish, she tells you about like how old she is. She tells you about where she lives and where she goes to school. She tells you about her family and her younger brothers, and also about her hobbies. So Helene did this website. She chose to sort of use the web as a ways of communicating with other kids, and telling about herself and interacting with other kids who might have similar interests or who might just be interested in meeting kids online. She also, for instance, shared music files, and she has this opportunity. You can write to her on her website and she will reply to you. So that's June 9th, 2000. Here is another website. It's from South Korea. It's from Seungwon Lee, who is based in South Korea. And this was archived in the Internet Archive in on November 4th, 1999. Here, Son Yang Wee, this is a machine translation. You can see it in English, and tells you about like how old he is, what his name is, what his hobbies are, and what he would like to be when he grows up. So here we have a situation where two children across the world choose to use this relatively new, like 10 years old, like infrastructure of the web to tell you about them, tell everybody who's on the web about themselves. So they choose this technical infrastructure and the ways that they have chosen to make web pages and to tell you about themselves, to communicate with other kids, to communicate with the world, which is that part of the world that is on the web. So that's a kind of similar situation where we see similarities in the uptake of this particular communication infrastructure. The websites, however, were part of, in the web ecology, they were part of different contexts. Helene's website was part of this homepage called the DOD, you could translate it to. which was set up as a library initiative in Denmark. So, so many libraries, or a substantial number of libraries, were engaged in making the web a place for children where children could communicate with other children, also sort of supporting children in making websites. So it's a very sort of comes from a very civic perspective, civic society perspective, like this, seeing children as somebody who could participate in this new online public space with the help of libraries. So that's public funded libraries. And there are other kids who you can see, you can enter their websites here. Sun Yang-Wi's webpage, on the other hand, was part of the, you could find that was indexed on the commercial website Naver Junior, which was a dedicated search engine for kids in South Korea. So Naver had been the big search engine for a couple of years, and then they had chosen in 1999 to make a specific search engine for kids, where you can see, you probably recognize this sort of, the curated links on websites, where you would not necessarily go in via the search field, but could also sort of look up websites using curated links. And so this is a commercial setup, commercial sort of ecology, media ecology, which Sun Yang-Wi's website was part of. So the infrastructure played out differently in the two countries, at least for the context that you could see these two children's websites within. The two kids, however, could also have met during, by engaging in web forums dedicated to kids. So here it's the web forum Kid Link, which actually spanned, so in 1996, it spanned 87 countries and had more than 60,000 kids participate. So it's obviously not all been on the web because of limited web availability before 1995, but it had run on internet, so like as bulletin boards, as a like email servers, and then it was moved to the web in 1995, and it connected, or it tried to connect kids from all around the world. We'll hear much more about the KidLink project later. There were, of course, also, and this is a website from the US, sort of established media companies jumped sort of on the chance to engage more kids with their commercial products. Here it's Cartoon Network that enables children to send in, to have children had their artwork posted on their website. So there were many of these commercial offers from already established media companies, but also for companies that cater to kids in different ways. So for instance, cereal companies like Kellogg was actually huge on the web and had a lot of offers for kids from very early on. In these three countries that I've just mentioned, the United States, South Korea, and Denmark, what we see here is an incredible growth in internet availability. So you can see that in homes for middle-class kids, in homes in these three countries, internet access actually became quite a stable household item over these 10 years from 1995 to 2005. And I will return to why this is important later. So the research design for the ERC Web Child Project is what I'm going to introduce right now. So in terms of historiography and theory and methods, what are we drawing upon? Well, it's a childhood at its core. It's a childhood history project. It investigates how childhood is conceived across the United States, Denmark, and South Korea, and how that conceptualization or different conceptualizations change over time in relation to the introduction of the World Wide Web. So it looks at things that are core to childhood history, such as children's agency, for instance, and children's relationship to adults, relationship to education, leisure time education divides. So those are some of the core issues that we're working with in the project. It's also, of course, a web history project. Not a lot of web history has engaged in sort of transnational or comparative history, but here is this is a project that actually tries to compare how the introduction of the web had how it affected and was affected by the ways that children engaged with it in all three countries. And it also looks at, and you will see that later, the transnational history, so the interaction between the countries. It is also then a comparative or global project about the 1990s and the 2000s. So the context in which we can see the introduction of the web and the ways in which childhood and the web is conceptualized and how they interact with each other. So that could be context such as, growing globalization in terms of economics, but also politics and, of course, technical infrastructure and neoliberalism, individualism. So the project does not draw upon methods and theory from psychology, but it does, however, look at like contemporary sources from the 90s and the 2000s, and how sort of psychology as a discipline was involved in, together with media studies, in defining some of the research topic that also impacted public debates about children and the internet. The project, however, draws upon sort of methods and theory from media studies and cultural studies. So looking at how, looking at media not only in a vacuum or in relation to single issues, but also looks at it as an ecology that is part of a much bigger societal influences and influence societies as well. So some of the theory that is used in this project comes from new cultural history, where you look not only at, for instance, like how discourses changed history, but also looked at praxes and combine like a look at how practices, social practices, and discourses together sort of make the changes of history. Looks at both materiality and language as something that changes history. The project also draws upon new studies of web archives and digital methods in history. So using a lot of the insights that we can see comes out of new ways of using computers in analysis of historical sources. The main question that the project asks is, how did the global phenomenon of the World Wide Web influence childhoods in South Korea, Denmark, and the United States from 1995 to 2005? And the conversation that the project hopes to engage in are, as I said, both like specific, like contributions to specific fields in history. That is, it's a childhood history project, wants to engage in, meaning also that we want to like go to conferences that publish, with in venues that is where you normally see childhood history presented. It's very important for us that it is a project that can be recognized as a history project by childhood historians, so that it doesn't only become sort of like a digital history project, but actually really engages with those like very good publications and very good analysis and analytical categories that already exist in this field, from sort of a more traditional history, humanities perspective. The same like with web history, the project really wants to engage with web history, furthering that field in terms of a more sort of transnational, going more transnationally with the history of the web, and also, yes, in terms of theory and methods, contribute to new cultural history in this intermix between sort of looking at discourses, but also looking at practices. Then the project also has an aim that is to contribute to historical research at large, showing how the web can be used as a historical source. At this point in time, it's not historians at all who's been driving the use of the web as a historical source. That's come from many other like brilliant scholars from other fields. But my feeling or like my argument is that the web is more than 30 years old. Now it's now time for historians to start thinking about what it means to use the web as a source for contemporary history. And in the project, we actually have some quite sort of hands-on initiatives, including building software that will make this easier for historians. Those are some of our aims with the project. And then the hope is that the results that comes out of the project can also be used as sort of historical backdrops for reflection in fields beyond history. So that could be psychology and media studies, but also as a historical backdrop for public debates about children and media. Here is sort of the very core research design in WebChild. That is, there is a level we investigate these 3 digital pioneer countries that all sort of, as I showed you in the table before, throughout the 10 years from 1995 to 2005 becomes like digital pioneers. That is South Korea, United States, and Denmark. All these 3 countries are analyzed on 3 different levels. There is this ideas level. On the ideas level, we investigate conceptualizations in public debates of the relationship between children and the internet, or children and the World Wide Web. So looking at public debates in radio and television and newspapers, but also how sort of research like that present day research, like that research at the time, how that fed into those public debates. We're going to look at usage, which is how children use the web. So looking at how children used websites, what kind of tracks and traces can we see on different websites, that like how children use them. We're also going to do interviews with people who were children at the time. Can tell you already it's not a problem to find people who wants to talk about this. People are very we've had a lot of sort of engagement from people who are very excited about the project, who are kids at the time. We're also, the third analytical level is sort of spaces. So that is looking at spaces that were designed and built deliberately for children. We know that there is a huge discrepancy between what children use. That is why we're going to talk to people who were children at the time, but also like what were the actual spaces that, for instance, libraries help build for children, or search engines, or media companies. And bringing all this together, we hopefully can see how the web influenced childhoods, but also, I should say, how children influenced the World Wide Web. We're also going to look at, of course, there are and we can see that already, there are engagements between the 3 countries. So things that are happening in the United States affects things that are happening in Denmark, but things that are happening in Denmark also affects the United States. There are like these very interlinked, and I think for the ReDICo project, very interesting connections between the 3 countries in terms of both like on the ideas level, where researchers or public debates sort of intermix between the 3 countries, but also, for instance, where code from the United States is used to build spaces for children in South Korea. So we are definitely, and I can I will draw on like my work that I've done on Sesame Street, which is a very transnational project, to look at these big links between the countries and projects that goes across the countries. So just to quote sort of Linehan 2025, this is a sort of, and I think, quote, like critical internet histories combining a material context and a text interpretive approach with a heightened sensitivity towards power relations in both material and textual internet-based context. This project will, that's, you know, end quote, and that's a big thing to try to do. But in this project, we are a lot of people, like you will see in a moment, and we will actually try to do this focusing on a childhood history perspective, and like trying to use that to say, like, if you're focusing on this theme, if you're focusing on this sort of this topic of childhood history and web history at the same time, then if you look at these analytical levels and try to weave them together in your analysis, what is that you can see how both sort of the material contextual development of the technical infrastructure of the web and the way that it is encoded in the websites that children use. And you then at the same time look at how children actually use the websites. You know, you can get at this this duality, or like this combination of how it is not only discursive or practical or practices that drives history here when we relate to sort of the history net in the internet for kids. It is a combination of those two factors together, and we will see how those actually, in this very sort of concrete way, how we will try to get at how they work together to make the web what it became in those 10 years for kids. So what are the basic assumptions that this, or hypotheses, depending on what field you're coming from, that we start from in this project is, well, we assume that there is a mainstreaming of the World Wide Web in children's everyday lives, that it actually does become a part of children's lives. And we have, in preliminary studies, investigated this already. We also assume that there is will be some similarities in the development of the web for kids because it's a shared infrastructure. Of course, an infrastructure can be used in many, many different ways. The web can be used in many different ways, but we also assume that there is inspiration across the three countries in how to use that shared infrastructure. Oh. We also assume that there are national variations in use, production, and conceptualization because these three countries have very different childhood cultures, and they also do have different media cultures. They also have an open and free press, but the media cultures are quite different in the three different countries. And lastly, based on preliminary projects, or based on preliminary studies, what we see and what we really want to investigate is also how the introduction of the web disrupted child-adult hierarchies. So in all three countries, there is this, in the public debates, conceptualization that kids are much better at using the web than adults are. So there is like a sidelining of parents or adults and their sort of authority in terms of what kids should and could do when it comes to the web. And that goes across all three countries. And we're really interested in looking at why that is and what effect that has on the power relations between kids and adults in this realm. So the project has a big team. There is an advisory board with people from childhood history, web history, and also experts on South Korea. And there is the team at Orange University with the early career researchers working on different parts of the project. Yeah, and I'm supposed to oversee all of it. The sources that we're using is, as I said, like there is print, so newspapers, for instance, for public debates, but also a lot of really interesting printed guidebooks for kids, like Cyber Surfer, the OWL Internet Guide for Kids from 1996 with floppy disks in the back. So that's really exciting. We use Archive Web, both sort of like the source code and sort of the browser view, so for close and distant reading. And we also try to combine like a scalable reading of like distant reading, a lot of websites at the same time as we also look at individual data points. So combining sort of a traditional humanities scholars perspective where you do close readings and very in-depth, but also look at representativity and look at bigger themes by using the source code. And reading that with digital methods. And then we're going to do oral history, interviewing both people who were children at the time and used the web, but also people who produced websites for kids. And we're going to do a 3-country survey. So let me talk a bit about the Kitling project, which is a pilot project that I'm doing at the moment together with a PhD student Sasha Bjerg, and an incoming PhD student on the Web Child project, Victor Harbo Johnston. So in terms of, I think the ReDICo project was very good and inspiring sort of this sort of what are the imaginaries, what are the interlinked imaginaries of the web at the time. And you see here all of these globes, right? It's like the World Wide Web, which is, and I'm sorry for the racial stereotypes here, but like intended to be both on like north of sort of Antarctica, in Arctis, and in South America. Like there is this idea of like kind of equally distributed computers for kids all around the world. And also that it would connect you via satellites, for instance, to everyone everywhere. And then that is a really interesting like imaginary and very sort of comes into the 90s with this end of history idea, globalization, liberalization. So like this kind of openness that brings together a lot of like political ideals and bring them into ideas of how children should and could connect ideally. Of course, that is not the case. So looking, for instance, here at a Korean statistic about like where web pages come from, and they mostly come from, yes, the US, France, Germany, Japan, and Korea are represented here. So it's not equally distributed. But of course, this idea of global connections can take off anyway, as an idea that some people want to fulfill. And for instance, the Global Children's Art Gallery here has representatives, has children sending in art from Malaysia, from Norway, from United States, from Italy, and also from Korea. There is a huge representation of children from many countries in a project like this, and that project comes out of this idea that doesn't think about like sort of the gap in access around the world, doesn't think about the gap in the gap in access, the gap in sort of access to hardware, but also the means to actually pay for the internet access at the time, which was very costly. But it does come out of this idea that we should connect children around the world, and that tells us also something about what children is thought of as these like bridges between different countries, like an apolitical thing that is not bound within structures, that childhood can actually sort of fulfill this promise of global connections in a special way that adults cannot, because children are seen as sort of rigid of all of the sort of bound prejudice that adults have. The KidLink project is another example of this sort of imagined connections, and that is built as a connective society for kids. So the KidLink forum started as an internet forum for kids already in 1990, and it's still running today. It started as a mailing list with 3 countries, Canada, United States, and Norway, and it grew rapidly. And 10 years later, 176 countries has participated, and there were activities in more than 30 languages. It was started by a journalist, but it mainly came to be run by educators around the world. But even though it was run from an educational point of view, it was a very sort of bottom-up perspective on how kids should communicate. To enter the KidLink project, Kid had to answer 4 questions. Who am I? What do I want to be when I grow up? How do I want the world to be better when I grow up? And what can I do now to make this happen? So these 4 questions are reflective of the ways in which children were conceived within this project. There is like the idea that children are actually already beings who can participate in sort of meaningful dialogue with other kids. They have to sort of question 1 and question 4 is sort of speaking to their here and now, the children being something already that can contribute. They can tell like who they are, and it's interesting who they are already, not only what they are when they become adults, but it's also interesting, like children are seen as somebody who can right now make a difference by thinking about like, what can I do to make this happen now? On the other hand, the middle 2 questions, what do I want to grow when what do I want to be when I grow up, and how do I want the place to be a better place when I grow up, they're pointing to children as becoming adults and to adult agency as something to be desired, as something that they should strive upon. So there is this also sort of educational idea of like children are not finished, or children lack something and they should aspire to be something more. And that goes into these 2 questions, so like pointing towards the children's future. However, there was so there is this duality between the in the KidLink project, between sort of taking children seriously while they're still children, but also seeing children as somebody who should, as someone who should grow up. And it was children between the age of 10 and 15 who could be part of the project. And here's just an example of one of the things that children wrote in about, like that was sort of looking back in time. I'm a historian, so I was like took this history project as I took this history that children contributed to, like so children could write about like your grandparents, how they imagined the world was without television or radio. Has a very interesting sort of media component, as media being central to children's imaginary of the now. Though it's interesting that it doesn't say what would the world be without the internet. So here we see sort of a foregrounding of like broadcasting media on the web, but that tells you also something about like what it is that the people who set up this project thought that were sort of the dominant media in children's lives. Even though they communicated on the web, it was television and radio. And children, they were like, so working with these sources shows you just how difficult it is to have a particular interest and going after that in terms of we are really interested in how did children communicate. Um, and most of what is archived in the Internet Archive from this project is things that educate, like it's the frameworks that educators set up. It's not the chats that children actually did. Though there are some we there are some that are archived, and we can see in those that children sort of also wrote about not only sort of history projects, but also wrote about, again, their hobbies. Hobbies are really like a central thing that children connect about. Uh, Hobbies, popular culture, but also just sort of interest in what it's like to live in your country. What is my country like? So this like striving, so this like interest in sort of connect with children who are who are also children, but who are different from you, and know what it's like to live in other countries. Here is just a just a brief screenshot from a chat from kids who were engaging in sort of this idea about like what do you want to, or how do you want the world to be better when you grow up. And I think this shows again the duality of this Kittling project. Lots of the things that children did talk about were grown-up topics like war, for instance. There was also a dedicated forum for children for the to talk about the first Gulf War. Um, and so children from affected countries, from the United States, from Israel, talked together about the first Gulf War. But in general, children were also talking about sort of the environment and peace are huge topics on this forum, at least of those that are archived. Um, and that shows that, but that shows that children were sort of seen as they shouldn't be protected. They were um, they were seen to have like an agency that enabled them to participate in these talks. What we don't see on this forum, or what is not sort of, at least not archived, and it's not in sort of the written sources that we have looked at, is things about, you would think like common themes such as bullying, for instance. That's not discussed. So that's really an interesting way of um, bullying or problems with school, for instance, or problems with family. There are these like sort of more private sphere issues of like your hobbies or music or something like that. But what is really encouraged is this ideal state of sort of global connections around topics that are of concerns to adults. There were also some kids in the United States discussing with other kids the deficit of the United States, and actually they got a reply from Bill Clinton because they'd hold a bake sale to help with the national deficit in the United States at the time. Um, but in that way, there is children's agency is seen and molded by this forum in a very specific way with very specific interests at heart. So those are sort of the global connection points that has to do with geopolitics rather than, for instance, global connection points to do with private sphere issues such as, yeah, it could be, for instance, bullying. And we're looking much more into these sort of these different conceptualizations of like what children are over the coming months. And one of the things that we are interested in is this imaginary of children as someone who would, that children would, if they were connected online, as an idea in this forum, they would actually be able to bring forward world peace. So that's also an imaginary about the internet as something that can bring together, if it brings together kids who are sort of seen as innocent in terms of not being so intertwined in terms of cultural, social, political issues as adults are, then that would be something, this global connection would be able to bring forward global peace. And combining children and the internet on this forum was a way to do that. So one of the problems that we have in the project at the moment, or one of the things that is really interesting for us, is that you can see here, these are the number of pages on kidslink.org as harvested by as saved in the Internet Archive. So we don't know how many, like, of course, we don't know anything about how many pages there were that has not been archived. But just looking at the archive number of pages, we have more than 25,000 in 2004. And that is, of course, something we cannot look into with traditional humanities methods, like looking at one data point, close up, like do close reading. So that is why we try in this project to do a distant reading some of the topics that we can find in these pages, and then hold them up against, or like see them against what we do with closed readings. And we are currently looking into developing a software that sits on that will help us do this kind of scalable reading. Some of you might be familiar with the Solar Wayback way of looking at archived internet WARC files, but we're looking into whether we can use that in a more systematic manner to do the kind of analysis that we as historians want to do with these web pages. Just here, one of the things that we have been looking at, or want to look more at, is sort of looking at the representation. This is the representation of kidlink.dk, so the Danish part of the Kidlink project, and looking at how that was represented in connection, or like in comparison with other sort of phenomena for kids at the time. And as you can see here, this is a representation, proportional representation of number of hits compared to how much of the Danish web has been harvested in that year. So in 2000, we can really see here that 2000 is a boom in sort of at least the archive number of Kidlink's pages on the Danish web. In 0.1% of all archived Danish pages from that year, we can see that Kidlink was represented. So it was definitely a 2000s phenomenon, it seems, on the Danish web. Another thing that we also want to do is that we want to look at link graphs, and that tells us something about how central a page is in terms of where it is on the web. We have not come very far with that, but it is for kids, and for kids' internet in particular, it's very interesting to see, like, where are the sites that are dedicated to kids? Are they seen as sort of walled gardens that should not be connected to the rest of the internet? They should not, or are they not linked to sort of a more sort of adult sites, or sites that are were meant for sort of general purpose use? Or are they connected to those sites? Like, we want to see, like, if we can look at those that were built purposely for children, what is the digital space for children at the time? And we want to, for instance, use link graphs to get at that. Just one thing, and this is not related to the Kidlink project. But it's something. It's one of the things that I really wanted to tell you about because of the ReDICo project. It's how central sort of Eurocentrism, and also an idea of like European high culture, was in the argument to for kids to get online. So in quite a few actually of the American guidebooks that we have looked through already, we see that one of the arguments for getting kids online was that they could go to the Louvre. It was not, the Louvre is a very specific reference that is made in like at least 5 of the guidebooks that we've looked at already. And it seems the argument seems to go like, okay, so children can learn a lot from going online, and they can experience there's this abundance of high culture from other countries that children can go explore, and the Louvre being sort of the peak, or the peak of sort of European high culture, or like maybe world culture for some of these writers of these guidebook. The main argument is actually, well, children can use the web to experience things they could never have experienced, and what it is that they should experience. Well, they should experience this particular peak of cultural sort of high class or high culture. So that's really interesting, and we want to look at these imaginaries of what is it that the children should use the web for.
Sorry, Helle, just to say, you've
Yeah,
already sort of hit the 45 minutes, just to say.
yeah,
Okay.
I'm coming to an end.
Okay, thanks. Sorry.
So my last slide is about this child-adult relationship, and you can see, which is one of the other things that we really want to look into with the project, is these are quotes from again American guides for American internet guides, but these are for adults, and they're all telling adults that they're far less good at using the web than their kids are. And that really speaks into one of these central themes that we want to look into with the whole project, which is how the adult-child relationship was shaped by the web, and also shaped the ways in which that children use the web. And we see them not only in these American guides, but also in the Korean and the Danish. So with that, there's just to say thank you, and I invite questions and comments. So thank you so much for listening.